Now take your Bibles and turn to Matthew 12. We're going to read, follow along. We're going to go from Matthew 12, 1 through 14. And we're going to be looking at two images: grain in the field and a withered hand. And with both of those, Jesus brings together some very important lessons for us that I want us to get this morning as we're going through Matthew. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." And he answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered into the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple desecrate the day and yet are innocent? I tell you that one greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." And going on from that place, he went into their synagogue. And a man with a shriveled hand was there, looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. And they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" He said to them, "If any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a man than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." And then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. Matthew moves in this section from just teaching to his ministry in action. And yet, in the middle of his ministry being in action, he's able to continue teaching and will use the specific occasion to drive home some lessons that are crucial for discipleship. And this interaction between Jesus and the Pharisees gets at the heart of the ongoing conflict and controversy that he had with them on a continuing basis. And it's fascinating to realize, this is kind of shocking, really, the way it ends. You would think that his answering their question, telling them why his disciples were eating grain on the Sabbath and why he was ready to heal this guy on the Sabbath, that they would say, "Oh, okay, that we understand now. Thank you for enlightening us." So that's not. They left and they plotted to kill Jesus. From time immemorial, unfortunately, religious fervor has often turned into violence. We've seen it all through human history. And because they couldn't silence Jesus, and he made too much sense, and they didn't like what he said, they went out and they plotted to kill him. And even at this point then in Matthew, you begin to see that it goes from their just not liking him, they're going to the next step. They're going to try to find a way to keep him quiet and silence him. Now, from two images then in this story, the grain and the withered hand, we learn a fundamental lesson about who Jesus is and what his ministry is all about, and how that frames how we think about ministry. There's a lot of neat things that I could talk about related to grain fields in Palestine. That's a fascinating study just in and of itself. But the thing that comes to mind when we look at that is the permission back in Deuteronomy 23, verses 23 through 25, that people were given, if they were hungry, they could pluck grain from a grain field, even though it wasn't their own. And they even made provision for the poor. They cut off the corners of their fields so that the poor could have something. And yet on this day, the disciples were hungry, and so they began to pluck and pick some heads of grain and eat them. There's a little bit of question on what the heads of grain were. Sometimes this phrase means corn stalk. Most of the time it means wheat or barley. So they're doing one of two things. They're either taking off ears of corn and shucking them and eating them, or most likely they were taking the heads of the grain of barley or wheat and doing like this so that they could, blow the chaff and then just pop the grain in their mouth. Now, you might want to ask the question, what was the problem here? We're going to address that. So on the surface, this episode makes it sound like Jesus doesn't care about what's lawful. Here's the interesting thing. He does, but the Pharisees don't think that he does. And it's because they don't think that he does, they give him all sorts of fits throughout his whole ministry. He's going to distinguish between what is lawful and unlawful. Well, let's start off then with, when we ask the question, what does it mean for Jesus to be Lord of the Sabbath? Several things come out, and this is the first one. To teach greater truths about what is lawful and unlawful. He was Lord of the Sabbath, so he's going to do that. In Matthew 12 here, the Pharisees think they know all about the Sabbath and how they're going to make Jesus pay for what he says, not knowing he is the Lord of the Sabbath. It's so ironic that they're talking to the Lord of the Sabbath about the Sabbath, and they don't really get what the Sabbath's about. Do you catch that irony? Well, let's look at the question that they ask. I think it gives you some insight. I found out that if indeed it is the disciples going through the wheat or grain or barley fields, and if they are, using their hands like this to get the chaff away from the grain and then pop it in their mouth, apparently the Pharisees came up with 49 things that could not be done on Sabbath because it would be considered work. Two of them are kind of interesting. One of them's here. They even came up with the rule that you could not eat an egg if the hen laid it on the Sabbath, because that hen worked. You're like, wow. Okay. Now, this is interesting because I read where that they had also added another law that for them, this was being lawful, that even when you do the grain in your hand like this, your fingers are working. So you're like, oh my. It's a mistaken notion, honestly, of what the Sabbath was all about. But that's how they view it. And that's why when they come to Jesus, see the question, look how they frame the question. Your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. As they saw themselves, what's the best phrase? Have you ever heard the expression keeper of the flame? They see themselves as keeping the tradition. And what we need to pick up on is that as they experienced and practiced their religion, they had a radar like this. They were looking out to make sure that they could see who was doing something unlawful. Now, we would say nitpicky, but that's not the word they'd use. They would say unlawful. And boy, if you did something unlawful, you're going to pay for it. There were different ways they made you pay for it. And so it's important to recognize how they viewed lawful. How Jesus views lawful is so much different than how they view it. Now, when we use the word lawful, we think of the word breaking the law. But lawful, from God's perspective, has intent of heart at core. Let me give you an example. I learned this when Nancy and I were working with a church in Bradford, Tennessee. This is our first church. I don't remember what I was in a hurry toward. Maybe it was visit somebody or whatever. But just as the light turned yellow, I thought, okay, boy, I got to hurry to make it through this light. and stopping coming the other direction was a school bus. The school bus stopped. And as I went by the school bus, he flipped out his stop sign. Well, there was a state police right behind the school bus. So as I went through like this, he turned his car and came after me, So I went to court with the ticket, and I thought now, and I don't know if Nancy remembers this, I had just bought a new suit. And this was back when men were wearing the three-piece suit. So it had the vest along with the coat, and it was a new black suit, and I was going to use it for funerals and weddings and stuff. So I thought, you know what? I'll dress up and go to court. So at least I'll look nice. So I went to court, and the judge looked at the petition and the charge, and he goes, "Have you got anything to say for yourself?" And I said, "Yeah, Judge." I said, I did go through the red light. It turned red as I went through. I was trying to go through because I had to be in a hurry to go somewhere. And just as I went through, the bus flipped out his stop sign. So I was like, oh. So he goes, "Well, you're all dressed. What do you do for a living?" I said, and the courtroom laughed. I said, "Do I really need to tell you?" And he goes, "Yeah, what do you do?" I said, "I'm a minister." And the whole courtroom erupted in laughter. And the judge said, "Just you being here is enough." So I didn't have to pay any charges or anything. He just let me go. But I was trying to be honest with the intent of my heart. I was in a hurry to go somewhere. Circumstances happened. I wish they hadn't. And it was kind of funny. So I thought about what that means. Intent of heart is so crucial. For anything you conceive of is lawful. And when God lays down law, and we human beings don't get this, unfortunately. When God gives us law and guidelines, Old Testament, New Testament, would you say that God gives us those guidelines because he loves us and cares for us? Isn't that what behind all of them? I mean, don't we have to give God a little credit to know what he was doing when he gave us those guidelines? Well, the Pharisees come along, they start making up their own rules for what is lawful and not lawful. It's kind of interesting because you almost need, throughout this section, when we use the word law and unlawful, you almost need quotation marks around it because it's a difference between the way they saw it and the way Jesus saw it. So what does it mean for something to be unlawful? Well, in their view, it's violating all of the extra details they had added to the law. Like I said, that's what they were looking for. See if someone was unlawful. And why did the Pharisees care about this? And I thought about this question, and here's what I came up with. And it's interesting because since they were in the role of keeping the tradition, they cared about the tradition more than people. They cared about their own view of how things ought to be. And they didn't want you, see, here's the thing. Do you realize Jesus got into trouble because he asked so many questions? And I've often said, if Jesus would have just kept his mouth shut, he wouldn't have had to go to the cross. He didn't. He would ask those pointed questions that would go to the heart of the matter. He was so good at that. And here, the Pharisees cared about this issue because they thought his disciples were violating a law that they thought was so important, and it violated the Sabbath, and they had their idea of what the Sabbath ought to be. This type of argument in rabbinical circles was called from light to heavy, which means as Jesus is answering this, if this is permissible, then what my disciples did is permissible. And that's how he's going to argue. And the rabbis knew that kind of argument. And this is why, if you'll notice, when he brings up this way of arguing and he goes back to the Old Testament, they knew this way of arguing and they couldn't answer him back. So what did they do? Well, the last verse of the paragraph is they plotted to kill him. And if you think about it, if they had had any kind of common sense response or a biblical response, that could have kept this discussion going on. But notice, Jesus' response, from their perspective, shut it down. So they're like, oh, okay, now we're going to get him. But they were used to someone arguing like this, a traditional way of the rabbis, and as a result, they didn't have any way to answer it. And this idea of Sabbath is so crucial right here. I didn't realize that till this week. In the book of Matthew, the idea of Sabbath, the teachings around Sabbath occurs 9 times. 7 of those 9 times for the word Sabbath are in this chapter 12. 7 of the 9. And it makes you realize this was, and think about this, as Matthew's recording the ministry of Jesus, this occasion where the disciples are eating the grain, and this poor guy with a withered hand in the synagogue, this became sort of the core moments. They're 2 moments, but they're put together. These 2 moments become the core central idea of Jesus trying to help people understand what Sabbath is all about. Historically, the church has kind of had a problem with this. We used to say to people, well, you know, it's a sin to miss Sunday. And I would hear that growing up. If you miss Sunday assembly, you have committed a sin. Well, now, wait a minute. The Bible didn't say that. You have to be careful with that. And what you have to ask, which often wasn't asked, what was God's intent for Christians to assemble on Sunday to start with? See, I could come and sit in the pew, not really care that I'm there, not even think about God's intent for the assembly, and go home, same kind of person, but you would think I was faithful just because I was sitting there. No. Look in Hebrews 10, a big long passage about God's intent for the assembly. Encourage one another. We worship God. We draw near to God. We draw near to each other. Just a big long paragraph that's beautiful about what the intent is for the assembly. Well, Christians have had the same problem. You end up judging people just because you don't see them sitting in the pew. That's not our place. I'll give you another example where this went awry. My youngest sister, for years, has struggled with the health condition with lupus. I didn't know this, but there's 2 kinds of lupus. There's the skin lupus, and there's the more dangerous systemic lupus. She's got the more dangerous systemic kind. She was so sick that for 6 or 8 months, she couldn't go to church. Well, the leaders of her church decided one Sunday they were going to get up, read her name, and disfellowship her because she hadn't been there in 8 months. Boy, she called me on the phone. She was so upset, so hurt. And I think she wanted me to go there and talk to those church leaders. I said, no. I said, I'd be the wrong person. I said, it makes me so upset. I would not be objective in talking to those folks. I'd want to wring some necks. No, I'd be the wrong person. But she said, well, why did they treat me that way? She was devastated. I said, well, you got some people who don't understand. I said, did any of those church leaders, before they sent you the letter, did they call you? Did they come by and visit you? She said, not one of them. There's your answer. They didn't have the heart of a pastor or a shepherd. No. And so this is another example. If you just check off the checklist, then you're okay. Really? Is that what Jesus came and died on the cross for? Did Jesus die on the cross to say, if you just do the checklist, you're okay? That's not what he died for. He died for our hearts. That's a big difference. So it was just amazing to me to discover that 7 out of 9 times, just within this short paragraph, you've got the whole focus in chapter 12 on the Sabbath. Jesus desires mercy and not sacrifice. This is a quotation, and actually this is the second time in the book of Matthew that he said this. Go and learn. What does this mean? He desires mercy and not sacrifice. Jesus himself had a ministry wrapped up in compassion and mercy. And the contrast here is between a sacrificial ritual and legalistic law keeping as opposed to caring about the human condition. Let me share with you what could have happened. When these Pharisees saw the disciples out there getting the grain like this and eating it, if those Pharisees had cared, they could have walked up to the disciples and said, we kind of think that you're violating the Sabbath, but what's more important, you guys are hungry. Why don't you come home with us and we'll serve you a meal? They didn't say that, did they? They didn't invite them home to help them alleviate their hunger. They just pointed the finger at them. So, and the idea of being hungry it's a fascinating theme all through the book of Matthew. Jesus feeds the hungry. The hungry figure in his ministry. Blessed are those that hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. All through the book of Matthew, this idea of hungry. And what it raises for us then in discipleship is asking the question, we know that we need to thank God for the way he blesses us physically so we're not hungry every day. But how in a world of being a disciple for Jesus, how does he fill that deeper hunger? And what does that look like? So mercy and compassion come to the forefront and being emphasized relative to Jesus' ministry. Mercy and compassion, day in and day out. And I can imagine that for his 12 disciples who followed him, there were times, well, remember James and John, the sons of thunder, called Boanerges, the sons of thunder. And I'm sure this was really representative. They saw people acting in such a way, they told Jesus, you know what? Let's just rain down a bolt of lightning on them. Let's just get this over with. No, Jesus was like, I'm not here to throw bolts of lightning at people. Okay? I'm here with compassion and mercy for human needs. So who is this Jesus? Interestingly, he's greater than the temple. The temple was huge in Jewish thought. For example, remember when we looked at oaths earlier in the Sermon on the Mount, you're not supposed to swear by the temple or the steps of the temple. The temple was considered real central and important to the history of the Jewish faith. But he said, no, there's someone greater here than the temple. And I am Lord of the Sabbath. So I can tell you how to approach the Sabbath. Now, I was looking, let me go back to the paragraph. There's a couple of things that come out that's really amazing to me. And I think I knew this at one time, but back in chapter 12 and verse 9, it's easy to miss this. He went on from that place and he went to the synagogue. This is where the guy needs his withered hand healed. Look at how it's worded. Going on from that place, he went into their synagogue, not God's synagogue. Do you catch that? Why is it the pronoun there instead of God? There means that these Pharisees had turned the synagogue into their own kind of game. It was their synagogue. And it's setting you up for Jesus' conflict in just a moment, where this withered man, and they're testing him. They're going to watch whether or not he's going to heal this guy on the Sabbath. And it's in their synagogue, which means it's where their rules are taking place. Okay, did you catch that? And so they're looking, look at verse 10. They are looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus. Can you imagine carrying out your own personal ministry and life of discipleship if people are watching you to find a reason to bring a charge against you? That'd be pretty uncomfortable, wouldn't it? So here Jesus is focused on healing and helping people. And when I see this picture, guess what? I see the Pharisees stand over here in the corner of the synagogue, and they got all the robes on, and they're kind of like this. They are looking for any single reason to bring a charge against Jesus. The doctrine of Christ comes out of his own teaching, and this is amazing. I knew it was a bunch, but I pulled together some ideas, and I'm going to run this through real quick because we don't have time to cover all this. There's at least 10 times in the book of Matthew where Jesus, either with something he says or something he's involved in, that helps us understand who he is. For example, from the very beginning, remember chapter 1, Emmanuel, God with us. The theme for our whole lessons coming out of Matthew is God with us. He is the fulfillment, secondly, of Old Testament prophecies. He also carries different messianic titles that the Jews would have thought somebody else was going to fulfill. Son of David, Son of God, Son of Man. All of those carry different Jewish expectations, but Jesus reframes those from the perspective of God's salvation, not the Jewish messianic expectation. Number 5, the authority that Jesus both proclaims and he instigates so that people can see it. Not only does he say, I am from the Father, but he goes, watch this. The Father gives me the power to do this. The confession of Peter, you are the Christ. When we get to that, we'll see why that confession is so important. The Great Commission at the end, all authority has been given to me in heaven and earth. Go and preach the good news. The suffering and the resurrection as fulfillment says so much about who Jesus is and he claims to be. And then some people frame it this way, and it's a fascinating to think about, that Jesus often sees himself kind of as a new Moses, that not only is he fulfilling the will of God, but places of teaching like the Sermon on the Mount, they're sort of there to replace kind of Israel's thinking of the role of the Ten Commandments. And what you're going to find is all of Jesus' teaching says, I have the authority to expand upon what you all are used to. And he tries to get at the heart, and that's who he is. Now, responding to the human needs, there's 2 of them that present themselves. The disciples that are hungry and the man with the withered hand. Jesus goes back, and we don't have time to read this narrative, but in 1 Samuel 21, 1-6, that's when David and his companions go into the house of God and eat the showbread. And he brings that up as an example. He said, haven't you read what David did? It was not lawful for them to do, only for the priest, but they went ahead and did it. Okay. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath day in the temple desecrate the Sabbath, and yet they're innocent? And we're not really sure exactly the specifics of these particular priests desecrating the Sabbath, but they think this is what it's referring to. Anything that you would do as a human bodily function, whether they were going to the bathroom or whatever, sometimes they didn't have time to go and cleanse themselves, like 7 days of a cleansing process. If you did something normal and didn't have time to cleanse yourself, for the priest that was kind of okay, because the more important thing was to guide the worship for the congregation of Israel gathered together. So it's a fascinating little thing that Jesus refers to here. And yet for both of these, he will use them as examples of their times when you have to think of the greater purpose. And notice in verse 6 and in verse 7, he uses the word innocent. In both of those occasions, David and the law for the priests, they were innocent. Important word. If you had known what these words mean, that someone greater than the temple is here, and I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. This is a fascinating phrase. Jesus is recognizing that apparently this has been going on for quite a while. These Pharisee leaders were condemning innocent people for simple things that they thought they were, being desecrating the Sabbath day and being unlawful. And Jesus said, no, you've gotten things so out of whack, you're condemning the innocent. And this is what really riled Jesus up. This is why he stood up for this. You don't take religion and beat people over the head and make them to be unlawful sinners just because they don't meet your criteria. Or you're making up something as a checkoff list, and if they don't make that checkoff list, then you write them off. And Jesus knows their hearts are in the wrong place. And this is why he said, you would not have condemned the innocent if you'd have been aware of all of that. So as we draw this lesson to a conclusion, he does say, if any of you have sheep that falls into the pit on the Sabbath, won't you do good? Lift it out? I said, of course. And then he makes, this is the second time in Matthew. Remember earlier, you're more important than the birds of the air, more valuable. Guess what here? You're more valuable than sheep. What this tells us is at the very center of everything Jesus did in ministry, he lifted up the value of the person. Every single person on the face of the earth is made in the image of God and has value. And if you denigrate that, if you disrespect that, if you deny it, then you're guilty of what the Pharisees were guilty of. So let's close this out then. What does the withered hand and the grain teach us about Christ? This is an amazing paragraph. The law honors God by addressing human needs. That's why Jesus came. Mercy and compassion frames our personal and our church ministries. Every single thing we do is motivated by love, compassion, and mercy. We serve an incomparably great Lord. He's greater than any religious ritual, greater than any massive church building or temple. Jesus, just with a wave of the hand, says, y'all are putting value on the wrong thing. I'm Lord of the Sabbath. Coming to Jesus results in healing that is restorative and healthy. One thing in here I caught, this is kind of interesting. When he healed the man with his hand, it says it was completely restored and sound as the other. The word sound is where we get our English word hygiene from. He was clean. His life was like it started over. Can you imagine what it's like to live with a withered hand and all of a sudden it's completely restored and healed? And this becomes a very powerful way of thinking of what Jesus does for the sinful soul. And so that the early church, understanding the power of Jesus at the cross, would be thinking much more than just the withered hand being restored. They would be thinking of sinners being restored to God, such that the work of Jesus is restorative and it's healthy. And it brings people into a right relationship with God. So through Jesus, we help fill the spiritual hunger by addressing physical needs with mercy and compassion. And we see Jesus doing that all the time. Don't ever think that when you respond to someone's need as a Christian, it's a wasted time, wasted effort. No, it's through those deeds of compassion that we reach the human heart. Look at everything Jesus did. With mercy and compassion, he would address the human need. And the thing that's neat about Jesus is he got to the place where that was so important to him, he was willing to violate the traditions of the Pharisees in their synagogue, don't miss that, in their synagogue, such that in Mark and Luke, in this synagogue scene, guess what they add that Matthew doesn't? And when I saw it, I went, whoa. In their account of this, they add the little phrase, Jesus said, come up here and stand in front. He did this on purpose to make a living point to these people that were hard-hearted, stuck in their ways, judging other people. Come here. He didn't want to do it. I want y'all to watch this. He added fuel to the fire. Oh my. So what a great lesson this is. And it makes you want to step back and pray, Lord, please help us keep our hearts in the right place. And that everything we do in the name of religion is really focused on you and serving other people with compassion. And we're not here to write people off, judge them, just because they don't meet our checklist. It challenges us. This is a really challenging paragraph.